September 1945, Luzon, Philippines. The war was over, but the air still smelled of cordite and rain. Rows of captured Japanese officers stood inside a fenced compound, their uniforms clean, but their faces hollow. Beyond the wire, the jungle whispered, humid, restless, indifferent to victory or defeat. They had been brought here from scattered garrisons, remnants of an army that had once believed surrender was worse than death. Most refused to speak. Some still bowed to no one. When the American officers arrived, the compound stiffened. A major from the U.S. Army, his tunic faded from field duty, walked to the front. Behind him, 2 MPs carried clipboards in silence. The prisoners expected orders, humiliation, perhaps a lecture on defeat. Instead, the major stopped before the senior Japanese officer, looked him square in the eyes, and bowed. It wasn't deep, nor theatrical. It was measured, the kind of bow that one professional gives to another. For a moment, time fractured. The Japanese officers froze. One trembled. Another's eyes filled. No words were spoken, but the meaning was unmistakable. The victors had shown respect, and in that quiet gesture the war, at least for a second, truly ended. The Pacific War had ended not with a single battle, but with a slow unraveling of belief. By the summer of 1945, Japan's empire, once stretching across the Pacific like a shadow, was reduced to scattered garrisons clinging to shattered islands. Every palm tree, every coral ridge, had become a shrine to a doctrine that could no longer sustain itself. Bushido, the ancient warrior code that demanded death before dishonor. On islands like Saipan and Okinawa, American troops had witnessed its extremes. Japanese soldiers charged machine guns with bayonets fixed and empty stomachs. Entire units fought to the last man. Civilians leapt from cliffs rather than face captivity. Surrender was not in their vocabulary, because to surrender was to vanish from the moral world of the living. In that code, even survival was shame. The Americans, hardened by 3 years of brutal island warfare, learned to expect fanatic resistance. They built flamethrowers for caves, trained to fight in jungles that swallowed sound, and advanced through mud and corpses. They were soldiers, not philosophers, but even they began to sense that they were facing an enemy whose war was spiritual as much as physical. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the devastation was beyond comprehension. Yet even then, Japan's leadership hesitated. The imperial military still wanted one final, honorable battle on the homeland. Only after Emperor Hirohito's unprecedented radio broadcast, his voice trembling, as he spoke of enduring the unendurable, did the nation finally yield. For millions of Japanese soldiers across Asia and the Pacific, the order to lay down arms was not a moment of relief, but of disbelief. Many had sworn oaths before shrines never to surrender. Now, standing on scorched beaches and bombed airfields, they faced a question that their entire training had denied. What does a warrior do when there are no battles left to fight? The first Americans who encountered these men after the surrender braced themselves for defiance. They expected to find suicide, sabotage, or bitterness. Instead, what they saw were hollow eyes, trembling hands, and a silence so deep it seemed sacred. The Japanese officers still saluted the rising sun on invisible flags, their discipline unbroken even in ruin. In Guam, Iwo Jima, and the Philippines, American forces gathered thousands of prisoners. The logistics were immense, feeding, guarding, and transporting tens of thousands of men who had once fought to kill them. Yet U.S. command, guided by the Geneva Convention and their own moral code, insisted on strict humane treatment. General Douglas MacArthur, who would soon oversee the occupation of Japan, made it clear, "The war is over. The time for vengeance is gone." This policy shocked many Allied soldiers who had endured the cruelty of Japanese camps. But for MacArthur and senior commanders, it was more than morality. It was strategy. To rebuild Japan, they had to first rebuild its dignity. Inside makeshift compounds across the Pacific, American officers enforced discipline without humiliation. Captured Japanese soldiers were ordered to keep ranks, salute their guards, and maintain their uniforms. They were not treated as criminals, but as soldiers who had fulfilled their duty and now awaited repatriation. Some Americans even returned swords to surrendered officers, a gesture that left interpreters speechless. For the Japanese prisoners, this treatment was more disorienting than punishment could ever have been. They had been told that Americans were barbarians who tortured captives. Instead, they found order, fairness, even respect. It did not erase the shame, but it unsettled the hatred. Many Japanese diaries recovered after the war described the same confusion. The enemy shows courtesy. I do not understand. Another read, They bow to us. They salute. Have we truly lost? What the Americans didn't realize was that every small act, every nod, every gesture of fairness carried immense symbolic weight. In a culture built on ritualized respect, to bow or salute was not trivial. It was moral acknowledgement, and for men whose souls were anchored to the code of Bushido, acknowledgement was everything. It was in this strange moral twilight, the space between defeat and reconciliation, that the incident at Luzon occurred. It wasn't planned or ceremonial. It was a spontaneous moment when soldiers from two worlds, both exhausted by violence, recognized each other as men again. The Americans had won the war through power, but in the months that followed, they began to win something deeper, the moral victory built not on conquest, but on restraint. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the Pacific fell silent in a way no one quite knew how to interpret. The gunfire stopped, but the machinery of war didn't. Camps had to be built, prisoners counted, officers interrogated, records catalogued, and graves marked. Across the Philippines, Guam, and Okinawa, bamboo huts and barbed wire fences rose within weeks, temporary sanctuaries for men who had outlived their own cause. American command divided prisoners by rank and branch. Officers in one area, enlisted men in another. The officers were treated with the decorum their status demanded, not out of admiration, but to maintain order. The U.S. Army had learned, often painfully, that humiliation breeds rebellion, while dignity enforces discipline. Japanese prisoners obeyed rank instinctively. To honor that structure was to prevent chaos. At Camp O'Donnell and later at the Luzon officer compound, American guards enforced strict military conduct on both sides. Japanese soldiers had to salute American officers. Americans, in turn, returned the salute, not as equals, but as professionals bound by shared codes. This simple ritual confused many young U.S. guards. They had fought through jungles filled with death cries and kamikaze charges. Their comrades had been tortured, executed, mutilated. Now they were expected to salute the very men who had orchestrated it. Yet the policy stood firm. General MacArthur's orders were clear. Conduct towards surrendered personnel will be firm but courteous. Discipline without hatred. Authority without arrogance. He understood what few others could. Japan's defeat had been total, but humiliation would only plant the seeds of future resentment. The occupation would succeed only if it preserved Japan's face. Within weeks, American officers began noticing a change. The Japanese prisoners, once withdrawn, almost ghostly, began to recover fragments of self-respect. They stood straighter, spoke more clearly, even volunteered for camp duties. Medical units reported fewer suicides. When treated with professionalism, they responded with obedience. By late September, the first joint ceremonies between American and Japanese officers were quietly introduced. It began with the daily flag protocol. The stars and stripes raised at dawn, watched by rows of captured men who still bowed their heads out of instinct. Soon after, U.S. officers permitted Japanese soldiers to perform their own morning rituals, salutes, ranks, reports, so long as they remained peaceful. These gestures, small as they were, began bridging a cultural abyss. For the Americans, respect was procedural, a matter of discipline and image. For the Japanese, it was sacred. Every salute, every bow, every exchange of formality restored a fraction of what surrender had stripped away. Honor. The bow in Japanese culture was not submission, but acknowledgement, an act that placed both parties within a moral order. To bow to a superior was expected. To bow to a former enemy was inconceivable. And yet, it happened. One event in particular would echo quietly through the post-war camps. In late September 1945, at a camp near Cabanatuan, a group of Japanese officers was formally received by an American inspection unit. The senior American major, a veteran of Saipan, listened to the list of prisoner names being read. When the last one finished, he stepped forward and bowed. Witnesses said the Japanese interpreter gasped aloud. The prisoners froze. Then, as though released from invisible chains, returned the bow in unison. It lasted only seconds, but that brief exchange marked something no battlefield could produce: a reconciliation through formality. For the Americans, it was a sign of control and magnanimity. For the Japanese, it was the first acknowledgement that they still possessed the right to be treated as men. Such incidents became rare, often unrecorded, sometimes denied. American soldiers didn't boast of bowing to prisoners, but among the Japanese ranks, word spread quietly: the enemy has shown courtesy. In a war defined by brutality, that single rumor was transformative. It softened rage, replaced fear with confusion, and began to humanize what propaganda had demonized. As winter approached, the camps grew quieter. Repatriation ships were being prepared. The men who had expected execution were now preparing to go home, not as ghosts, but as soldiers who had witnessed something their leaders had said was impossible: mercy from an enemy. And for many American officers, that realization carried its own weight. They had seen how easy it was to destroy, and now how difficult it was to rebuild. The war in the Pacific had ended through force, but the peace that followed would depend entirely on restraint. Rooted in centuries of samurai tradition, Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not a set of written laws, but a moral gravity. It demanded loyalty unto death, devotion to one's emperor, and above all, dignity in conduct. To be captured was not merely a failure of arms, it was the annihilation of one's moral self. From the beginning of the Pacific War, Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender stripped them of humanity. Allied leaflets urging them to give up were dismissed as insults. When American troops began capturing small numbers of prisoners in 1943, the Japanese High Command labeled them missing in action, refusing to acknowledge their existence. To admit that one had been taken alive was to bring shame upon family and country. That was the psychological battlefield onto which the Americans stepped in 1945. When an American officer bowed, he was not just bending at the waist, he was violating the hierarchy of victory. To the Japanese mind, such humility from a victor was incomprehensible. The bow, which in their culture defined respect and relationship, was suddenly reversed. It did not degrade the victor, it humanized him. In that moment, the conqueror became the moral equal, and the vanquished, for the first time, felt seen. For many Japanese officers, captivity was worse than death. Inside the camps, suicide attempts were common in the first weeks. Some refused food, others tried to provoke guards into shooting them. But over time, as American behavior contradicted every expectation of cruelty, something shifted. A strange internal conflict took hold. If the enemy was merciful, then perhaps the empire's vision of the outside world had been a lie. This realization was not celebrated. It was endured. Shame remained, but it began to coexist with curiosity. The guards' discipline, their fairness, even their casual gestures, passing cigarettes, returning salutes, using surnames instead of insults, became moral puzzles. One Japanese colonel later wrote in his diary, "They do not gloat. They do not curse. They walk among us as men who have conquered themselves." That line captures the psychological essence of post-war captivity. The defeated studying the victors not for weakness, but for restraint. To the Americans, respect was procedure. To the Japanese, it was redemption. When an American bowed, he did what no sermon or document could. He gave permission to feel human again. For men who had been raised to die in loyalty, that was not humiliation, but relief. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, hatred had been easy to justify. Propaganda dehumanized the Japanese as fanatics and beasts. On both sides, the war had stripped away empathy. The battles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima were not fought between men, but between mythologies. So when the war ended, the real moral battle began. Not against the enemy, but against vengeance. American officers who had fought for years now found themselves face to face with the same soldiers they had once hunted. Many had personal losses, friends executed in Japanese camps, comrades tortured on Bataan, and yet, standing inside those same barbed wire fences, they chose professionalism over retribution. This discipline did not come from sentimentality. It came from a belief deeply rooted in American military ethics. Power is proven not by cruelty, but by control. MacArthur's command understood this better than anyone. The goal was not just to win the war, but to prove that democracy could be merciful without being weak. When the major at Luzon bowed, he wasn't making a political gesture. He was fulfilling a principle as old as civilization: respect as a weapon of peace. To the Japanese prisoners, the bow was unimaginable. To the Americans, it was inevitable. That contrast defines the moral distance between two cultures that had spent 4 years destroying each other, and now stood, for the first time, on common moral ground. Every war eventually ends with faces. Not flags, not headlines, just human faces staring at each other when the noise is gone. In that compound in Luzon, there were no generals present, no journalists to record it. Only men, young, tired, hollowed out by years of killing, watching an enemy show grace. For many of them, that moment did what ideology could not. It ended the war inside their minds. One of the American MPs later recalled, "They looked at us differently after that day. They started saluting first. They stood straighter. They smiled when we said, 'Good morning.'" Small changes, invisible to history, but monumental to the people who lived them. The Japanese officers, many of whom would return home to a nation humiliated and starving, carried those memories into the ruins of their cities. Years later, in post-war memoirs, several referred to similar gestures: bows, salutes, even shared cigarettes, as the moments that taught us America had defeated not Japan, but hatred. The Luzon bow was not an isolated miracle. It was the visible surface of an invisible transformation. When two armies, exhausted by total war, began to rediscover what civilization looked like, and in that rediscovery lay the seed of something extraordinary, the peace that would one day turn enemies into allies. The true test of leadership rarely comes in triumph. It comes in what follows. For the American officers stationed across the Pacific in late 1945, victory brought not celebration, but responsibility. They commanded tens of thousands of prisoners from an army that had once vowed never to surrender. Every decision they made, from how to conduct roll call to how to distribute rations, was being watched, not only by their own troops, but by the defeated enemy as a measure of American character. General Douglas MacArthur understood this intimately. His leadership style during the occupation of Japan was almost paradoxical: stern authority coupled with deliberate dignity. He ordered strict adherence to military form but forbade unnecessary harshness. He believed that how a victor behaves after war defines whether peace will last. At the operational level, this doctrine filtered down through hundreds of officers who adopted a code of quiet restraint. Major William R. Smith in Luzon, Captain John McCloy on Okinawa, Colonel Kendall Fielder in Honolulu. Men who had fought brutal campaigns now practiced a new kind of warfare: psychological stabilization through discipline and respect. They saluted captured generals, enforced curfews without cruelty, and demanded that every American soldier remember, "We are not jailers. We are professionals." Such leadership was not born from compassion alone. It was strategic. The Americans recognized that Japan's surrender had left its soldiers spiritually leaderless. Their officers, now prisoners, could either become sources of unrest or pillars of order. By acknowledging their rank and humanity, The U.S. Army kept the structure intact and prevented rebellion. In military terms, respect became a containment strategy. In human terms, it became the first step toward reconciliation. For years, Japanese soldiers had been told that capture meant torture, mutilation, and death. Leaflets dropped by American aircraft were dismissed as psychological tricks. Propaganda films in Tokyo depicted Allied troops as demons who would defile women and burn temples. So when surrender came, many prisoners prepared to die rather than fall into American hands. Yet when they were treated with fairness, even civility, that propaganda disintegrated overnight. An American intelligence officer in Guam noted in his 1945 report, "Their shock at being treated decently exceeds all other emotions. It is as though we have destroyed a myth older than this war." That collapse of propaganda was one of the most powerful silent victories of the Allied campaign. The Americans didn't need to shout ideology. They simply behaved differently. Every orderly meal, every medical treatment, every respectful command undermined years of indoctrination. In several camps, interpreters reported that prisoners began referring to their captors as Seijitsu Nateki, the honest enemy. The phrase spread quietly among repatriation groups returning to Japan. It would reappear years later in memoirs, a phrase that historians would come to see as one of the earliest linguistic bridges between two former enemies. The power of that shift cannot be overstated. Wars are fought with bullets, but they end with stories. The story of the honest enemy did more for post-war diplomacy than 100 speeches could. It humanized America in the eyes of a broken nation, and replaced hatred with a reluctant form of admiration. Historians often struggle to interpret moments like the Luzon POW because they resist categorization. They are not strategic events, not treaty clauses or battles. They are moral tremors, fleeting, unrecorded, yet transformative. The photographic record of POW camps shows weary faces and neat rows, but not gestures. The bow, the salute, the handshake. These existed in the space between the frames, transmitted through memory and testimony rather than documents. Yet they were real. American war correspondents in the Philippines, such as Clark Lee and Frank Hewlett, wrote later of the quiet professionalism that marked U.S. conduct toward Japanese officers. Hewlett described one scene. An American colonel offered a cigarette to a Japanese general before questioning him. Both bowed slightly, neither spoke. The act itself seemed to close a wound that words could not. This was not sentimentality. It was civilization asserting itself after barbarity. In Japanese post-war literature, these episodes became moral reference points. The novelist Shohei Uka, who himself had been a prisoner, described the American guards as firm but not cruel, victorious yet restrained. In his essays, he would later write that the discipline of the Americans taught Japan that defeat without degradation was possible. Across cultures, that is perhaps the deepest reconciliation possible, when the victor's behavior allows the vanquished to retain self-respect. In that sense, the bow in Luzon symbolized the birth of post-war Japan itself, a nation learning to rebuild not through defiance, but through acknowledgement. By late 1946, most of the Japanese prisoners in the Philippines were repatriated. They boarded ships under the same flags that had once opposed each other. Before departure, many bowed deeply toward the camp's American officers, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. Some brought small hand-carved gifts, wooden combs, painted fans, paper cranes folded from ration wrappers. The Americans, often too moved to respond, simply saluted. Years later, when Japan became one of America's closest allies in Asia, these early gestures seemed prophetic. They foreshadowed a future built on mutual respect rather than revenge. What began as a bow inside a rain-soaked camp had rippled across decades, a moral echo that no treaty could capture. It proved that even in a war born of hatred and extremity, humanity could survive if discipline guided power. That was the quiet miracle of 1945. Not just peace, but the rediscovery of civilization. The morning of September 27, 1945, began like any other inside the Luzon officer compound. The sky was pale, washed with the humid haze that hung over the Philippine plains after rain. In the distance, an old American truck rattled toward the main gate, tires grinding against wet gravel. A formation of Japanese officers, about 80 men in total, stood silently in their assembly area, boots aligned, caps straight, eyes fixed ahead. They had been told an American inspection team would arrive that morning. What they did not know was that the visit would become one of the most symbolic moments of their captivity. Major William R. Smith, the American officer assigned to conduct the inspection, had fought in the Marianas and seen death in every imaginable form. He had watched friends fall at Saipan, witnessed Japanese soldiers blow themselves apart with grenades rather than surrender, and seen civilians jump from cliffs into the Pacific. To him, this camp was not a victory post. It was the quiet aftermath of horror. As he stepped out of the truck, he saw the Japanese formation standing in rigid silence. Their discipline was remarkable. No talking, no movement. Even in defeat, they looked like statues of endurance. The senior officer, Colonel Tetsuya Nakamura, stood at the front, his hands trembling slightly against his thighs. Nakamura had commanded a regiment on Luzon that fought to the last platoon. Now he was a prisoner of the men he had once sworn to destroy. The American inspection party approached slowly. 2 military police followed, rifles slung, their boots echoing on the packed earth. Smith stopped 10 feet from the front line. The interpreter, a Nisei sergeant from California, gave a crisp command. "Attention!" Dozens of Japanese boots snapped together in unison. The sound was sharp, precise, a relic of an army that had ceased to exist. Smith studied them for a long moment. He expected defiance, maybe resentment. Instead, he saw exhaustion, not just physical, but moral. These men were hollowed out by belief, emptied by loyalty to something that no longer lived. And in that moment, something within him shifted. The interpreter whispered, "Major, sir, you may begin the inspection." But Smith didn't move. He simply looked at Nakamura, whose gaze was locked forward, unblinking, as though staring into the idea of defeat itself. Then, without a word, Smith stepped forward, drew a slow breath, and bowed. It was not the stiff military nod of acknowledgement. It was deeper, deliberate, formal, and utterly sincere. The kind of bow that transcended rank and language. The kind that could only mean one thing: "I recognize your humanity." For a heartbeat, the entire camp froze. The American guards blinked in disbelief. The Japanese officers did not react, not immediately. The act was so unthinkable that their minds seemed to reject it. A victor bowing to the defeated? It contradicted every fiber of their world. Colonel Nakamura's lips trembled. His chin quivered slightly as though fighting against the instinct to respond. Then, very slowly, he returned the bow. Lower, longer, trembling. Behind him, the rows of Japanese officers followed. Dozens of men bowed in perfect synchronization, their movements rigid, but their faces overcome by something indescribable. One man at the end of the line began to weep silently. The American soldiers standing nearby didn't speak. Even the jungle seemed to fall quiet. It was as if time itself had stopped to bear witness. When Smith straightened, he gave a single nod to Nakamura and spoke through the interpreter. "Discipline and honor will be maintained here. You are soldiers. You will be treated as such. Nothing more. No speech, no sermon." He turned, saluted once, and walked back toward his truck. Only after the Americans left did the sound return. Faint, broken, human. Some of the Japanese officers exhaled sharply. Others clasped their hands behind their backs as if trying to maintain composure. A few looked down at the ground, their eyes wet, unable to explain to themselves what had just happened. They had seen the unimaginable: respect from the enemy. Later that evening, the interpreter who had translated Smith's brief address noted in his log, "The Japanese officers appeared stunned. Many expressed confusion. One said, 'I no longer understand what victory means.'" Word spread quickly through the camp. Men who had refused to speak began murmuring. Some saluted American sentries for the first time. Others stood taller during roll call, no longer as captives, but as soldiers once again bound by discipline rather than shame. That bow, a single human gesture, accomplished what months of military orders and humanitarian briefings could not. It restored the concept of mutual dignity. When the report reached Manila headquarters days later, it was treated as a curiosity, a minor note in a long list of inspection records. But among the Japanese prisoners, it became legend. By the time they were repatriated months later, the story of the American major who bowed was told again and again, sometimes with details altered, sometimes exaggerated, but always with the same reverence. And in that reverence lay the first quiet seed of reconciliation between two nations. That night, the camp was unnaturally still. The rain had stopped, leaving a thick, heavy silence that settled over the compound like fog. In one of the wooden barracks, Colonel Nakamura sat at a crude table lit by a single oil lamp. The flame flickered against the thin walls, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the men seated around him. They were all officers, men who had once commanded hundreds, now confined by wire and memory. None of them spoke for several minutes. Then one finally said, almost to himself, "The American bowed." The others nodded faintly, as if confirming something they could not yet process. For men raised in the Imperial Army, where surrender erased identity, such an act from a victor was inconceivable. It was not kindness. It was a kind of moral disarmament. Nakamura stared at his hands for a long moment before replying quietly, "We were defeated in battle. But today, we were seen." Outside, an American sentry paced along the perimeter, his rifle slung loosely over his shoulder. He could hear fragments of low Japanese voices drifting through the night air, mixed with the rhythmic chirping of insects. The camp was calm, calmer than it had been in weeks. Even the guards sensed the difference. Something intangible had shifted between them and their prisoners. The following morning, at roll call, the Japanese formation assembled as usual. But before the American duty officer gave his order, Nakamura stepped forward, turned sharply to face the direction of the guard post, and saluted. The movement was crisp, precise, unmistakable. The Americans froze for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Then the officer on duty, a young lieutenant, hesitated briefly and returned the salute. It was a simple exchange, less than 3 seconds. But every man watching understood its weight. For the first time, respect was no longer one-sided. From that morning onward, the atmosphere of the camp began to change. The Japanese officers, who had once avoided eye contact and moved mechanically, started engaging with American personnel in small ways, asking for books, offering help in repairing tools, or quietly assisting medics in tending to sick prisoners. One day, a U.S. sergeant discovered that the Japanese had cleaned the camp's parade ground without orders. When asked why, their interpreter replied, "The colonel says a place of honor must not be untidy." Word of these changes reached the headquarters in Manila. Reports noted that discipline among the Japanese POWs was exceptionally high, morale improving, and hostility virtually absent. The American officers attributed it to improved rations and better conditions, but those who had witnessed the bow knew better. It was not food or comfort that restored order. It was respect, returned for respect. In late October, Major Smith was reassigned. Before leaving, he made one final visit to the camp. When his jeep arrived, the Japanese officers stood in full formation once more. As he stepped out, they bowed deeply, a synchronized gesture, silent and exact. Smith removed his cap and saluted in return. The moment hung in the humid air like a closing chapter. As he turned to leave, Nakamura took a step forward and spoke through the interpreter. "Major Smith, you have defeated us in arms, but you have also defeated our hatred. That is a greater victory." Smith said nothing, only nodded, but his jaw tightened. He would remember those words for the rest of his life. After the war, when Japanese prisoners were finally repatriated, stories of American behavior spread throughout the devastated homeland. Many expected tales of brutality. Instead, they heard of food shared, cigarettes offered, and, most astonishingly, of American officers who bowed. These accounts clashed with the image of Americans painted by wartime propaganda. For a nation wrestling with humiliation, such stories offered an unexpected form of solace. Perhaps defeat had not destroyed their honor after all. Historians later found that the Luzon POW, though never officially documented, resonated with a larger pattern emerging across the Pacific. At Okinawa, American medics treated wounded Japanese prisoners with the same care as their own. At Guam, officers allowed Japanese captains to retain swords as symbols of rank. In every instance, the intent was not sentimentality. It was the calculated restoration of order through mutual recognition. The war had been total, but its conclusion demanded restraint. For the Americans, these gestures required discipline, the strength not to humiliate. For the Japanese, it required humility, the courage to accept humanity from those they once called enemies. Together they forged the earliest strands of reconciliation, thread by thread, gesture by gesture. Years later, when peace between the United States and Japan became one of the strongest alliances in modern history, few remembered the men who had lived behind those fences. Yet in their quiet exchanges, a bow, a salute, a shared cigarette, the moral foundation of that alliance had already been laid. The bow at Luzon was not an act of theater or pity. It was civilization asserting itself over chaos. It was proof that even after 4 years of merciless war, one man's restraint could silence an entire legacy of hatred. And for every soldier who witnessed it, American or Japanese, that moment became something sacred. The instant when the war truly ended in their hearts. The weeks that followed the Luzon incident marked a quiet transformation across many Pacific POW compounds. Nothing official changed, no new orders, no revised regulations, but the tone of daily life shifted in ways that couldn't be measured by reports or records. The barbed wire remained, but the invisible wall between captor and captive began to erode. American guards, once rigid and distrustful, found that the Japanese prisoners no longer averted their eyes or moved with mechanical submission. They carried themselves differently, shoulders straight, faces composed, not as rebels or subordinates, but as soldiers regaining a fragment of self-worth. For the first time, mutual discipline replaced silent hostility. Major Smith's bow became something of a legend inside the camp. Some guards dismissed it as sentimental foolishness, but the senior officers who had seen enough war recognized it for what it was: a psychological victory. One sergeant later wrote in a letter home, "You can beat a man into obedience, but you can't shame him into peace." The major understood that. The bow was his way of ending the war for real. Across the Pacific, similar transformations began to surface in subtle but powerful ways. On Okinawa, American medical staff began treating Japanese prisoners with open empathy. Some even taught them English phrases. In Guam, a U.S. colonel instructed his troops to salute captured Japanese officers as soldiers who fought bravely but lost. These acts were not about forgiveness. They were about control. The demonstration that victory meant more than domination. In the Philippines, the Luzon compound became a model of stability. American MPs reported no escape attempts, no riots, no insubordination. Prisoners organized study circles, cleaned their quarters without orders, and repaired their own uniforms. In November 1945, a small chapel was built using scrap lumber. The structure had no altar, only a simple wooden plaque that read in Japanese, "For those who fell, on all sides." When MacArthur's headquarters received word of these developments, he approved a policy to maintain respect-based discipline in all POW facilities. His reasoning, recorded in an internal memo, was blunt but visionary. Humiliation creates hatred. Order built upon respect endures. Meanwhile, the Japanese government, now under Allied occupation, began documenting testimonies from returning prisoners. Among the most striking were those who described acts of American courtesy as moments of moral awakening. One former naval officer interviewed in Tokyo in 1946 recalled, "When the Americans saluted me, I felt not pride, but relief. I realized that I was still human, that my honor had not died with defeat." These confessions began to ripple through Japanese society, especially among families who had long assumed their captured sons had perished dishonored. Instead, they learned that many had been treated with humanity. In a culture built on shame, that revelation was revolutionary. In Washington, a few policymakers took note. Psychological analysts attached to the Office of War Information wrote reports observing that humane treatment of prisoners had accelerated Japan's post-war acceptance of Allied authority. The American strategy had shifted from total war to moral occupation, conquering not just territory, but perception. By December, when repatriation ships began loading prisoners for return to Japan, the atmosphere was one of strange, quiet respect. At the Luzon compound, as men boarded the trucks that would take them to Manila, the American guards lined the road and saluted. The Japanese officers bowed deeply in return. No words were exchanged, but the silence carried the weight of understanding, the kind of silence that follows closure. The journey home for those prisoners was not triumphant. Their nation lay in ruins, their empire gone, their emperor silenced. But they carried with them an unexpected inheritance, the realization that honor could survive even in defeat. And for many, that lesson had begun with a single gesture, the bow of an American officer under the pale sun of Luzon. By early 1946, the great movement of repatriation was underway. Ships left from Manila, Okinawa, Guam, and Saipan, their decks crowded with thousands of former Japanese soldiers, thin, quiet, and staring toward a homeland many feared would no longer recognize them. Each man carried a cardboard tag stamped with a number and a name. Beneath those numbers, however, lived something deeper. Memories of how the enemy had behaved when all power was theirs. Among the returning officers were men from the Luzon compound. Colonel Nakamura kept a small notebook with him on the voyage home, its pages stained with humidity. On one page, he had written a single English word he had learned from the interpreter: respect. He underlined it twice. Years later, his son would find that same notebook in an old cedar box, the word still legible, a fragile souvenir from the ruins of war. When the prisoners arrived in Japan, they stepped off the ships into a silence almost as heavy as the one that had greeted surrender itself. Cities were flattened, railways twisted, families displaced. For those who returned alive, survival carried its own stigma. Many expected to be treated as disgraced men. Yet, as their stories spread, something unexpected happened. In small newspapers and local gatherings, tales of humane treatment by American officers began to surface. They were modestly told, a gesture here, a cigarette shared there. But one theme repeated again and again. The Americans had shown respect. For a nation drowning in shame, these accounts became a subtle balm. They didn't erase the defeat, but they reframed it. If even the victors had behaved with dignity, perhaps Japan could learn to rebuild on the same foundation. In Tokyo, occupation authorities under MacArthur noticed the effect. Social analysts within the government section observed that former POWs returning from the Philippines and Guam displayed a striking absence of bitterness. Instead, they spoke of discipline, structure, and fairness. Some even praised the Americans' efficiency, their sense of order, qualities that Japan itself would soon adopt in its post-war reforms. What no one had predicted was how these personal experiences of respect would ripple outward into national identity. By 1947, Japan's reconstruction efforts were underway. Its new constitution renounced war, but its cultural pride began to rebuild. This time, not on conquest, but on craftsmanship, diligence, and mutual regard. The same soldiers who had once seen the bow of an American officer returned home to become teachers, civil servants, and engineers. Many carried quiet memories of that moment as a moral compass for the rest of their lives. Historians looking back often focus on policy and diplomacy, the Marshall Plan, the Tokyo trials, the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. But beneath those grand events were the unseen foundations laid by individual acts of restraint. Every time an American saluted a captured Japanese officer, every time a guard treated a prisoner with fairness, the myth of hatred weakened, and the architecture of post-war friendship began to rise. In the 1950s, when Japan and the United States officially became allies, very few remembered Luzon. There were no plaques, no parades, no speeches, but in quiet veteran reunions, men from both sides spoke softly of the war that had nearly erased their humanity, and of the small gestures that had restored it. Some wrote letters of thanks to their former captors. Others simply bowed before photographs of fallen comrades, remembering that peace had been built not from forgiveness alone, but from recognition. Major Smith never returned to the Philippines. He retired in 1949 and lived quietly in Kansas until his death decades later. His family discovered among his papers a photograph of a Japanese officer bowing on a muddy parade ground. On the back, in fading ink, he had written, "True victory is learning to bow without surrendering your soul." That sentence, like his gesture, never appeared in official histories. But its echo lived on, in classrooms, factories, and generations who never saw war. For Japan and America alike, the peace that followed was not born in treaties. It began with a single act of discipline, a bow between enemies who refused to stay enemies. History often remembers wars through the roar of artillery and the signatures on treaties. But the truth of peace is quieter, found in gestures too small for the official record, too human for political language. The bow at Luzon was one of those moments, a brief, silent bridge between two civilizations that had spent years destroying each other. It proved something essential, that respect can exist even where mercy seems impossible. When Major Smith bowed, he wasn't forgiving an enemy. He was affirming a principle older than the war itself, that dignity, once offered, disarms more deeply than any weapon. It is the last frontier of discipline, the victory over hatred. For the Japanese officers who witnessed that moment, it became a moral awakening. They had been raised to believe that surrender erased worth, that honor ended with defeat. Yet here stood their conqueror, acknowledging them not as subhuman, not as enemies, but as men. The shock of that recognition would ripple through their memories, and later, through their nation's rebirth. And for the Americans, it became a test of moral endurance, a reminder that the power to destroy means little without the strength to show restraint. In that act, they proved that civilization survives not through dominance, but through self-control. When the two nations later stood side by side, rebuilding cities, sharing technology, defending freedom, few remembered the faces in that dusty camp. But the spirit of what happened there lingered in the unspoken code between former enemies turned allies. It whispered through decades of peace, "Honor your enemy, and you honor yourself." The bow was not surrender. It was remembrance of everything lost and of everything still worth saving. A gesture that required no translation, no flag, no ceremony, just two soldiers. One victor, one defeated, reminding the world that even after its darkest hour, humanity could still stand upright and bow.